Hello, and welcome to this introduction to JBoss EAP 6. This is the first in a three-part series on JBoss EAP 6, and in later editions we'll be looking at the key differences between 5 and 6, and also migrating from 5 to 6. But for this webinar we'll be looking at installation of JBoss, configuration, clustering and load balancing using mod cluster. A quick introduction to myself. My name is Andy Overton. I work as a Senior Managed Services Consultant for C2B2 Consulting. So what are we looking at building today? Well, we're looking at building a very basic two-node cluster. So we have two JBoss servers here, my server 1 and my server 2. We're going to deploy a small test app called Cluster Test onto both machines or both servers. And we're going to use Apache with mod cluster for load balancing. The software versions I've used for this demo, it's a VM with Ubuntu 12, dual core with 4 gig. We're using JBoss EAP 6.0.1, which is the latest version. We're using JDK 1.7. We've got the Java home environment variable set. And we'll be using Apache 2.4.3 with mod cluster, and that's the version of mod cluster I'll be using. So what we'll be looking at today is installing JBoss and adding in an admin user. We'll be looking at setting up our basic two-node cluster, running our two servers, deploying an application, setting up Apache and mod cluster for load balancing, and then testing our setup at the end to prove that it does what we expect it to. So you may have come through this through our YouTube channel, which as you can see there, and we also do a blog where this will be available with a few more details in there very shortly. So if you want to access that, you can access it there. Okay, so first things first, we need to install JBoss. As with previous versions, this is very simple, and it's basically just a zip file. So we're going to unzip that now, and I'm just going to zip it into my home directory. Okay, so there we are. Now, in previous versions of JBoss, you had a bunch of server configs, and you could copy those. But in JBoss 6, it's slightly different. We use config files, depending on the type of server you want. So basically what we want is, because we're going to be making two servers, we're going to take a copy of this. We're going to call one of them my server 1 and one my server 2. Okay, so we'll rename this one to my server 1. And then we'll do a complete copy, and then we'll rename this one to my server 2. Okay, so we have our two servers. Now the next thing we need to look at is adding a user. So in JBoss 6, they've made this easy. They've created a script in the bin directory, and that's called add user. So if we run that script now, this allows us to add the user we require. So we're looking at our admin user. So if we accept the defaults here, so it'll be a management user, management realm, we'll give them the name admin, and we'll give them a password. Username admin is easy to guess. Well, we're not too bothered about that for this demo. Is this correct? Yes, we do want to add the user, and then for the final question, just answer no. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing now for my server 2. Again, we're going to do the add user file, and again accept the defaults. default, admin, and a password. And enter the password. Do you want to add this user? Is this correct? Yes, yes. And then to the final question, no. Okay, so we now have our two servers set up. We have two admin users, one for each. So next up we're going to look at clustering. Okay, so the first thing you need to know, clustering is very simple in JBoss 6. We have, as I mentioned earlier, rather than having individual directories that you copy for your server configurations, you can use a bunch of configuration files. So if we're going to my server standalone, and under configuration you'll see here a bunch of XML files, and this standalone ha.xml has clustering automatically set up. But what we're going to do is we're going to edit this, and we're going to change it so that we use TCP rather than UDP, which is a very common thing to want to do. So what I've done, I've created a little bit of text here so I don't have to type it all in. So we're going to edit this standalone ha.xml, which is the high availability, which gives us clustering. And we're going to do a search in here for TCP. Okay, so we can find here the TCP stack. And we're going to put in the text I just copied into there. Okay, now basically what this tells us is that we've got two initial hosts, and the timeout on them is set to 2000. That's basically 2 seconds, but as they're both on the same machine, that's really not going to be an issue. So we're going to do the same again for my server 2 in standalone config, using the standalone ha.xml file. And again, search for TCP. Tell it to use the TCP ping protocol for our two hosts. And there we go. Okay, so we now have our two servers. We now have admin users on both, and we have clustering set up to use TCP. So now we want to look at running our two servers. So for this, I'm going to open a couple of terminal windows. Now, in order to run it, I've created a couple of shortcut files. So I'll just show you what's in these. We've got one called start.start1 and one called start2. Okay, so in start1, they're both basically the same. I'll show you start2 in a second. In start1, we're running this standalone shell script in the bin directory of your server. You're telling it the node name, in this case server 1. Here's where we tell it the configuration we want to use. So we're using our standalone high availability.xml, which gives us our clustering capabilities. And this is the address we're going to run on. Using the 4 zeros basically means that I can access this from a remote server or a remote machine, but you can set that to just be your local machine. So start2, basically the same, except this time we're looking in my server 2, and we're calling it server 2, and the only additional piece of information we need to give it is this binding port offset. Now this basically tells it that to run on a different port, because obviously we can't have the two machines or the two servers run on the same port, so this gives it as an offset. So everything that's running on server 1 will be offset by 100 for server 2. Okay, So I'll start up my two servers. Okay, as you can see, JBoss 6 is very quick. 7.5 seconds for starting up there. Then we'll start up our second server. And again, let's start it up, okay. Okay, so next up we're going to look at deploying our test app. One of the things you'll notice if you look in your consoles windows is that you won't actually see the nodes in cluster on initial startup as you did in JBoss 5. Basically, you'll need to deploy an application which has the distributable tag in the web.xml in order for you to actually see anything come up in here to tell you it's clustering. So let's take a quick look at our test app, cluster test.water. So as I said, in our web.xml, you'll see it's got the distributable tag. And then basically it's just a very simple JSP which will display a bit of information about who's making the call, which server's handling it, just to give us an idea so we can test later on for if the load balancing is working correctly. Okay, so as you can see, this is an exploded WAR file. So we'll copy that. Now we need to copy that into our two servers. So we go to my server 1, get into standalone and deployments. Paste that in there. My server 2, standalone deployments. We'll paste in there as well. Now we'll see a message come up in here. This is why I mentioned that it's an exploded WAR file. Now you'll get a message in here stating that it's found your WAR file, but in order to trigger deployment, you need to create a file. Now this is something new in JBoss EAP 6. By default, auto deploy of zipped content is enabled, but auto deploy of exploded content is disabled. So what you'll need to do is, in your two deployment directories, basically just create a blank document and name that the same as the file that you want to deploy, with the words do deploy on the end. And what you'll see here, a little file called is deploying, and then eventually it'll switch to be deployed. So we'll do the same for my server 1 under deployments, create an empty file, cluster test.war, same as my folder, and then do deploy on the end. Now we see a bunch of messages stating that it's been deployed. And we also see messages regarding clustering. So we'll see here, receive new cluster view, clustering, new cluster view for partition web. So various messages stating that it's doing clustering. So we can also see, if we open up a browser and we go into the console, so the console is at 9990/console. And we can see it's up and running fine. Now if you want the console for the other app, sorry, not app, server, as I mentioned earlier, the port offset is 100. So rather than it being at 9990, it'll be at 10.0.90. Okay, so that's the two servers are opening nicely. So we can close that. And the next thing to set up is going to be mod cluster, which we're going to use for load balancing. So if we open a new terminal, you'll see here I have mod cluster already in this directory. And basically we want to unpack that and it'll put it where it needs to go. Okay, so if we unpack that now, I'm doing this as sudo because it installs it in /opt/jboss. So that basically gives us a full install with that particular mod cluster file. That gives us a full install of Apache with mod cluster. Okay, so next up we just need to do a slight change to Apache. We need to tell it what the server name is, otherwise you'll get error messages regarding that. So here we're going to edit, and you're looking for the httpd.conf file, and that can be found here in /opt/jboss, httpd again, and then conf. Oh. There we go. Okay, so we're going to edit this file. It's just one simple little change. If we just search for server name, you'll see here there's a line commented out. So we want to uncomment that, and we're going to basically tell it that our server name is localhost. Oops. Okay. So next up we need to actually start Apache. So again we're going to use sudo, and in order to start it, we're looking in /opt/jboss, httpd, and it's in the sbin directory, and there's a file called Apache CTL, Apache console, and then we basically want to tell it to start. It's as simple as that. Then hopefully you should be able to go to localhost here and see the wonderful message, it works. So in here you will see a couple of messages stating it will use a JVM root and then a big long number, and that basically tells us that mod cluster, and because JBoss EAP 6 has got mod cluster built in, it's got mod cluster capabilities built in, so there's actually very little config on the JBoss side. You'll see this message, and that's basically stating that the two have linked together. Now we can also see there's a handy console for mod cluster. Now this can be found at localhost on port 6666, and then it's mod_cluster_manager. Okay, so in here we can see our two nodes. and what port they're running on. And we can see our cluster test app available in both. So we're ready to test. Okay, in order to do that, open our browser back up, and if we go to localhost/cluster test, we'll see our test app, which basically tells us that server 1 is receiving this request. So if we refresh the page, we'll see that all the calls are going to server 1, and we've got a number of requests placed on this session. So we're going to show that failover is working, so as they go into server 1, it may be server 2 in your case, but basically close down the one that's currently doing the serving. So if we shut down server 1, we'll get a bunch of messages in server 2 saying that there's a new new cluster view with just itself. And if we now refresh this page again, we'll see it's moved over to server 2. And then all future calls go to server 2. Now, we may not want this. We may want to turn off sticky sessions. Sticky sessions basically means that all calls will keep going to the same server, whereas what we may want to do is not do it that way and load balance between the two. So what I'm going to quickly show you as a final thing is how to turn off sticky sessions. So in order to do so, we again need to change our standalone ha.xml, which is in here. And we're basically looking in here for the section on mod cluster. And there we have it. So in order to turn off sticky sessions, it's very simple. We're just going to add a new attribute in here where we say sticky session equals false. Oops, I've got numlock on. Okay, so we've done that for my server 1. Need to copy the changes or do the same change in my server 2. So again, we're looking for mod-cluster, and we're going to add in sticky session equals false in the same place. Okay, so if we now start up our two servers again, okay, we point our browser again, localhost/cluster test. Now what you see here is the node ID is server 1. So the server 1 is currently serving our client. But if we keep refreshing that, we'll see it switching between server 1 and server 2 as it load balances between the two. Okay, that's the end of it for today. As I said, there's a more detailed version of this available on our blog, with a few more details on some of the areas that I've covered today. But I hope this was useful, and I hope you'll join us for the following two in our series. We'll be looking at the differences between EAP 5 and EAP 6 and migrating from 5 to 6 as well. Thank you very much. Goodbye.